The letter hit the floor of Zara Nolan's feet like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it sent through her chest would not stop. "You knew," she said, and her voice was so quiet that the wind outside the saloon nearly swallowed it whole. "You knew this entire time and you said nothing." Fletcher Morrow stood across the room with his hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly, watching her with those steady gray eyes that had once felt like the safest place she had ever looked. Now they felt like a deception she could not name. The floorboards between them might as well have been an ocean. "Zara, do not say my name like that." She pressed one hand flat against the bar top to keep herself standing because her knees were doing something treacherous. "Like you are sorry, like it was small. Like this was some harmless misunderstanding between neighbors." He took one step forward and she raised her other hand to stop him. The letter on the floor was from the Cattlemen's Association of Fort Worth, Texas, dated October the 9th, 1881. It was addressed to Mr. Fletcher James Morrow, owner of the Morrow Cattle Company, 40,000 acres in Randall County, and the single largest beef operation in the Texas Panhandle. The letter thanked him for his recent charitable donation of $3,000 to the Amarillo Orphan Relief Fund, and wished him continued prosperity in the upcoming winter drive. $3,000. She had watched this man eat beans from a tin plate and tell her it was a fine supper. She had handed him her last 2 bits to buy bread at Morrison's General Store because she thought he could not afford it. She had lain awake some nights worrying about him, a drifting ranch hand with patched boots and a borrowed horse, wondering how a man so decent had ended up with so little. He had not ended up with so little, he had started with everything. "How long?" she said, and this time the quiet in her voice was not fragile. It was iron. Fletcher Morrow closed his eyes. He had known this moment was coming. He had prepared for it, rehearsed it, dreaded it the way a man dreads a storm he can see for miles before it hits. But standing here, watching the trust leave her face like a fire going out, nothing he had rehearsed came close to being adequate. "Since the first week," he said. The saloon around them held its breath. Somewhere out on the street, a horse stamped in the dust. The October sun was doing its best through the clouded windows and failing entirely. Zara Nolan looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached down, picked up the letter, folded it along its original crease, set it on the bar, and walked out the door. He let her go, because some things must be earned back slowly, and because he had been the one to break it. But before the story of that breaking can be told, there is the story of the building, and that one is worth every word. It had started 5 months earlier, in the last week of May 1881, on a road outside of Tascosa that was more dust than road. Zara Nolan was 24 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of deliberate living, and she had been running the Copper Bell boarding house alone for 11 months since her father passed. Thomas Nolan had been a good man and a poor businessman, and the boarding house he had left her was carrying a debt she could feel in her teeth every time she looked at the ledger. She had managed it. She was still managing it. But the managing had taken on the particular quality of a woman standing on ice that she knows will hold, but does not trust. She had been driving her buckboard back from Tascosa, where she had gone to price new mattress ticking, when the wheel on her left side had found the worst rut in the panhandle and snapped its spoke. She was standing in the road looking at it with the philosophical expression of someone who had used up their capacity for dramatic reaction on worse problems, when a man on horseback came around the bend from the east. He was not a remarkable-looking man at first glance. He was perhaps 30 years old, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired under a plain brown hat that had seen better years. His clothes were clean but worn in the honest way that working clothes wear out, at the elbows and the collar, the knees of his trousers. His horse was a plain bay with no particular flash to it. He looked like any number of ranch hands who drifted through the panhandle following cattle work and seasonal wages. "That looks like a problem," he said from the horse, studying the broken wheel. "It is a problem," she agreed, "but not one that requires an audience if you are only passing." He swung down without being invited, which she noted but did not object to, and crouched beside the wheel to look at it properly. His hands were large and rough, the kind that had wrapped rope and mended fence and done real work for years. She noticed the hands because hands told the truth about a man in ways his face often did not. "Spokes gone clean through," he said. "You are not driving this anywhere without a new one." "I am aware of that. I could ride ahead to Hartley's and send someone back, or," he looked up at her. His eyes were a particular shade of gray that reminded her of sky before a storm that turns out to be nothing. "Or I could see if there is enough here to rig something temporary. It would not be pretty, but it might get you home." "Where are you headed?" "Coyote Flats. The Copper Bell." Something crossed his face that she could not read. It was brief and careful, like a card being tucked back into a deck. "I know it," he said. "I am heading that direction anyway." "Name is Fletcher. Fletcher Morrow." "Zara Nolan." She watched him. "You said you know the Copper Bell. Have you stayed there before?" "Not recently. I heard it was a decent house." He worked on the wheel for the better part of an hour while she held the horse steady and handed him tools from the small box she kept under the seat. And during that hour, they talked in the way people talk when they are working side by side on a problem, which is to say honestly and without performance. He told her he was looking for work in the area, that he had come down from the Colorado Territory following a job lead that had not panned out. She told him about the boarding house, about the rooms she had, and the price she charged, which was modest because she was competing with the hotel in Tascosa for the better-heeled travelers. When he had the wheel rigged well enough to limp her home, he rode alongside the buckboard the whole way to Coyote Flats without being asked. She did not point out that this was unnecessary. It was, in fact, welcome, though she would not have said so. The town of Coyote Flats in the spring of 1881 was not a grand place. It had perhaps 300 souls, a main street with a saloon called the Dusty Boot, Morrison's General Store, a church, a smithy, a telegraph office, and the Copper Bell boarding house, which occupied a 2-story frame building at the east end of the street that Zara kept scrupulously clean and perpetually worried about. She had 3 long-term boarders at the time. There was Mr. Hadley Crane, a retired surveyor of 62 who ate the same breakfast every morning and never complained about anything, which she privately considered his finest quality. There was Mrs. Agnes Prout, a widow of 55 who was waiting for her son to build her a proper room on his homestead, 20 miles east, and who in the meantime occupied herself by having opinions about everyone in town. And there was Tom Vickers, a telegraph operator in his late 20s who worked at the office and paid his rent 2 weeks ahead every time without fail. She had 2 empty rooms when Fletcher Morrow rode in beside her buckboard. She rented him one that evening. He paid a month in advance in coins that he counted out from a leather purse with the care of someone for whom money was not easy to come by, and she gave him the key to the corner room upstairs that caught the morning light and had a view of the street. She would later think about that money, about how carefully he had counted it. She had believed, completely and without question, that it cost him something. That was, she would eventually understand the most precise part of his deception, because Fletcher Morrow was, in actual fact, obscenely wealthy. He was the only son of James Harlan Morrow, who had come to Texas in 1859 with $40 and a single cow and had, through a combination of talent, brutality of will, and a particular genius for knowing when land was about to become valuable, built an empire. James Harlan had died in 1876, leaving Fletcher everything, including 40,000 acres, 3,000 head of cattle, a house in Amarillo that had 12 rooms, and a reputation that preceded him into any room in the Texas Panhandle like a flag before a parade. Fletcher had grown up with that flag. He had grown up watching women come to his father's house and look at the rugs and the wallpaper and the silver on the table and see a prize rather than a person. He had, at 26, been engaged to a woman named Cecilia Hartfield who had told him, in a conversation he had never forgotten, that she did not particularly need to love him as long as the house was large and the winters were comfortable. He had ended the engagement, and she had seemed more puzzled than hurt, which told him everything. After that, he had spent 4 years building the empire he had inherited into something larger and more complicated, and in the process had become somewhat harder to reach. The men who worked for him respected him. The men who did business with him trusted him. But the women who were presented to him at dinners and dances in Amarillo looked at him the way Cecilia Hartfield had looked at the silverware, and he could not make himself care. He had heard about Zara Noland from his ranch foreman, a big, honest man named Cole Bridger who had come through Coyote Flats the previous winter and stayed at the Copper Bell. Cole had mentioned her the way people mention things that struck them as worth remembering. He had said simply that the woman who ran the boarding house there was the most straightforwardly decent person he had encountered in years, and that the coffee she made was the best in 3 counties. Fletcher did not know why that stuck, but it had. He had ridden out to the Panhandle in late May with the particular and somewhat embarrassing private intention of simply seeing for himself. He had not planned to stay. He had not planned to take a room or spend a month there or build his whole elaborate ruse. But then the wheel had broken, and he had looked up at this woman standing in the road with the dust on her dress and the absolute unaffected practicality in her face, and something in him had quietly but completely changed direction. And then, because he was a man who had been deceived by performance for most of his adult life, he had made the decision not to tell her who he was. He told himself it was just for a few days, just to see. He wanted to know what she was like when she did not know she was looking at money. He wanted one honest experience of a person before the flag preceded him. He had not predicted that the few days would become weeks, or that the weeks would become months, or that somewhere in the middle of it, he would fall so thoroughly in love with her that the thought of telling the truth had become the most frightening thing he had ever faced. The first weeks were simple enough. He worked odd jobs around Coyote Flats, helping at the smithy, mending fences for a homesteader named Roy Gates who had a sick wife and too many acres and not enough hands. He ate supper at the Copper Bell like the other boarders and paid for it out of his carefully counted coins, and he watched Zara run her house. The watching was not idle. It was the kind of watching that happened before a person understood they were doing it. She was up before 5 every morning. She hauled water. She started the stove. She made breakfast for her boarders from ingredients she had measured carefully, because waste was something she could not afford. She fixed things herself when they broke, a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink, a hinge on the back door that had begun to sag, the step on the back porch that had gone soft. She did not complain about any of it. She simply addressed it and moved on to the next thing. She was not humorless. That was what surprised him most, given how much she carried. She laughed easily at small things and had a dry, offhand wit that caught him off guard on a regular basis. She had opinions about cattle policy, about the railroad's pricing, About a recent piece in the Amarillo newspaper about women's property rights that she had read aloud at supper one evening with a calm, measured fury that had made old Mr. Crane applaud. She treated every boarder with the same steady, thoughtful attention, including Fletcher, who did not deserve it under false pretenses and was beginning to feel the weight of that. One evening in late June, about 3 weeks into his stay, she sat down across from him at the kitchen table after the dinner things were cleared. Everyone else had gone to their rooms. The house was quiet. There was a kerosene lamp between them, and outside the window the panhandle sky was doing its extraordinary evening thing with orange and purple that made even a lied-to man feel briefly forgiven. "You are not looking for work," she said. Not accusatory, observational. He looked at her. "I have been helping Gates with his fences. Gates pays you almost nothing because he has almost nothing. That is not what I mean." She folded her hands on the table. "I mean that you do not have the manner of a man worrying about money. You are comfortable. Not in the way that money makes a man comfortable. Something else." He was quiet for a moment. This was the first time she had pushed against the fiction, and he felt the precise nature of the choice before him. He could tell her the truth right now. He almost did. "I am comfortable in my own company," he said finally, which was true without being sufficient, and he hated himself a small amount for it. "I am between things. Sometimes a man needs to be between things." She looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that were uncomfortably perceptive, and then she nodded as though this were an answer she would accept for now. "Well," she said, "you are welcome to be between things here as long as you like, as long as the rent gets paid. It will." She stood and took the lamp to carry it to the stairs, and at the doorway she paused and looked back. "I do not know what you are running from, Fletcher Morrow," she said quietly, "but I have found that whatever it is usually catches up regardless. Better to face it while you still choose the ground." She went upstairs and left him in the dark with that, which was exactly where he deserved to be. July in the Texas Panhandle was its own particular kind of hell, and the people who lived through it every year did so with a combination of stubbornness and resignation that Fletcher had always privately admired. The heat was not polite about itself. It arrived before sunrise and stayed past dark, and it came with a dryness that cracked lips and turned the earth to something that was not quite dust and not quite dirt, but some angry combination of both. During that July, several things happened that shifted the story between him and Zara into different territory. The first was Agnes Prutt's son not coming. He had written to say the room was not ready, that there had been trouble with the lumber delivery, that he hoped his mother could wait another month. Mrs. Prutt had sat at the supper table reading this letter with a face that showed nothing, which was how Fletcher knew it cost her everything. He had watched Zara quietly refill Mrs. Prutt's coffee and say, in a perfectly ordinary voice, that she was very glad the stay could continue, and that the room was nicer for having her in it. Mrs. Prutt had not said anything, but her shoulders had dropped about 2 inches. He noticed that. The second thing was Roy Gates. Gates came to the Copper Bell one Tuesday evening with his hat in his hands and a face that looked like a man walking toward a conversation he would rather step around. His wife, Alma, had taken a turn, and the doctor from Tascosa was asking for payment before he would come out again. Gates needed to borrow $20, which was everything and more in that county that summer. He had asked Fletcher because they had been working together, and because he did not know who else to ask. Fletcher had $20 in his pocket, which was, as he maintained the fiction, the remainder of his month's wages from the smithy work and the fence mending. Giving it to Gates meant he had nothing. He gave it to Gates. He did not make a production of it. He simply counted it out and said Gates could pay him back in work or not at all, whichever came easier. Gates had gripped his hand and gone. Zara had been in the kitchen doorway. She had seen the exchange without meaning to, and when Gates left, she brought Fletcher a plate of cornbread she had clearly made extra of, set it on the table in front of him, and said nothing about it at all. He had not needed to say anything either. The cornbread said more than adequate things. The third thing that happened in July, and the most significant, was the night of the dust storm. Panhandle storms could come up with barely any warning and could turn a clear afternoon black in 30 minutes. This one arrived on a Thursday evening just before dark, and the wind came in ahead of it like a scout, rattling windows and sending anything not nailed down skidding across the street. Fletcher had been out past the edge of town helping Gates finish a stretch of fence. He had made it back to the Copper Bell just ahead of the worst of it, and he had come in the back door with his eyes full of grit and his shirt plastered to him, to find Zara in the kitchen with her boarders, all the windows latched and rags pressed along the sills to keep the dust out as best she could. She had handed him a damp cloth for his face, without looking up from where she was pressing a rag along the base of the kitchen door. He had stood there for a moment with the cloth in his hand, just watching her move through her own house with this absolute, unhurried competence, directing Agnes Prude away from the window that was rattling worst, checking that Mr. Crane had his chest medication because the dust was bad for his breathing. The storm lasted 3 hours. They sat in the kitchen by lamplight with the wind doing its worst outside, and they played cards and talked and Mrs. Prude told a story about a worse storm she had survived in Kansas in 1869 that had gone on for 2 days and had cured her husband permanently of wanting to live on the prairie. Mr. Crane fell asleep in his chair. Tom Vickers won every hand of cards by such consistent margins that Fletcher began to suspect he was counting something. When it was over, and the wind had dropped to just a sulk, Zara went outside to check the back of the house for damage, and Fletcher followed without being asked. They walked around the building in the dark with a lantern, both of them checking the walls and the roof and the small stable out back where her horse stood. The air smelled of earth turned inside out. She found a piece of the back porch railing that had been torn loose and was hanging at an angle, and she took hold of it and tried to assess the damage in the lantern light. "I can fix that in the morning," he said. "I know you can," she said, without the slight implication that she needed him to. She just said it as a fact, which was a different thing entirely. He looked at her in the lamplight with the storm-dark sky above the Panhandle and the whole quiet aftermath around them, and the feeling in his chest was so specific and so irrevocable that he could not pretend he did not know what it was. "Zara," he said. She looked up from the railing. He almost said it. He almost said the whole thing right there in the dark with the lantern between them and the smell of the storm in the air. He could feel the truth of it pressing against the inside of his ribs like something that had been held in too long. What he said instead was, "I am glad I ended up here." She held his gaze for a moment and something moved through her face that was careful and searching and not entirely guarded. "So am I," she said. "Now go to sleep. That railing will wait until morning." He fixed the railing in the morning, and 24 other small things in the days that followed, and they continued as they had been, and the lie continued as it had been, and Fletcher Morrow found new reasons every day both to tell her and not to, and the weeks accumulated with the particular cruelty of something beautiful built on a foundation that will not hold. He told himself, after a while, that he was genuinely useful, that the work he did around the house and around town was real work, that it had value, that it was not nothing simply because he did not need the wages. He took the coins from the leather purse each month for his rent, and he held them out to her, and he watched her put them carefully in the tin box she kept in the kitchen drawer, and he thought, "This is what I can give that is not tainted by what I have." But of course it was tainted. The entire pretense was. He knew it most clearly one evening in late August when they were sitting on the front porch of the Copper Bell as the day went down. The other boarders had drifted inside. It was just the two of them in the cooling air, rocking chairs slightly angled toward each other because they always ended up that way. Nobody had ever deliberately moved them. She had been doing the accounts for the month, the ledger open on her knee, and she had set it aside with the expression of someone putting a difficult thing down until tomorrow. "Bad month?" he asked. "Not terrible," she said. "The roof repair cost more than I planned. And Crane paid late because his niece in Lubbock had a baby and he sent money." A pause. "I will make it work. You always do." She looked at him sideways. "You say that as though you know me well enough to be sure of it." "I have been watching you manage this house for 3 months," he said. "I am sure of it." She turned to look at him more fully then, and the last light of the day was doing something extraordinary to the planes of her face that he was not going to think too hard about. "Why are you still here, Fletcher?" she asked. It was not unkind. It was honest, which was what she always was and what made him feel the lie most acutely. "You have been here 3 months. You work odd jobs that barely cover your board. You could go to Amarillo, to Fort Worth, find real wages on a proper drive. You are capable enough." "I like it here," he said. "That is not an answer." He was quiet for a moment. A coyote called somewhere out in the dark flats, distant and thin, and then was quiet. "I found something here that I did not know I was looking for," he said carefully, which was as true as anything he had said to her and as incomplete as everything else. She looked at the street for a while. "I found something too," she said finally, in a voice so quiet he almost missed it. "I am not sure what to do with it." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the street still, her hands folded in her lap over the closed ledger, and she was very deliberately not looking back at him. "Zara, do not make it complicated tonight," she said. "I am too tired and the roof costs too much, and I would just like to sit here for a little while and not complicate things." He settled back in his chair. "All right," he said. They sat there until full dark came in over the panhandle, and the stars emerged in their extravagant abundance, and neither of them said another word, and it was one of the finest hours of his life, and it was built on a lie and he knew it and could not stop it. September came with the first cool edge in the air, and the beginning of the fall cattle season, which was the busiest time across the panhandle, as the drives that had gone north in the summer came home and men settled up at the end of the year. Fletcher's operation in Randall County would be running at full pitch right now. Cole Bridger would be managing it, as he had managed it the last 2 autumns when Fletcher had taken himself off somewhere to think. Cole was loyal and competent, and did not ask too many questions, which Fletcher appreciated more than he could say. He had sent a letter to Cole in August, routed through the telegraph office in Tascosa, so it would not come through Coyote Flats and be seen by Tom Vickers, who was a friendly man but not precisely a private one. The letter said he was well and to continue as they had planned, and to handle anything that came up with the Cattlemen's Association in Amarillo. And Cole had wired back a single line, handling it, "Come home when you are ready." Fletcher was beginning to understand that when he came home, he would not be coming home alone, or he would not be coming home whole. Those were the only 2 options he could see from where he stood. In September, Zara's debt came to a head. She had inherited the boarding house with a note on it held by a man named Daniel Sutter, who was not technically a bank but functioned as one for people in Coyote Flats and the surrounding area who could not get credit from an actual institution. Sutter was not brutal exactly, but he was precise and businesslike, and he had come to the Copper Bell one Tuesday morning in September with his coat on, and his hat straight to tell Zara that the note was due for renewal at the end of October, and that he would need a larger payment than the previous year's installment due to the interest that had accumulated. Fletcher heard this through the open kitchen window while he was fixing the porch step. He was not eavesdropping deliberately. He was simply close enough that the conversation came to him. Sutter wanted $90. Zara had 60, maybe, if the next month went well. She did not let any of this show in her voice during the conversation with Sutter, but after he left and the front door had closed, Fletcher heard the particular sound of something being set down on the kitchen table with more force than was strictly necessary, and then a long silence. He put his hammer down and went inside. She was at the kitchen table with her ledger open, a pencil in her hand, doing the arithmetic that was not going to come out right no matter how she arranged it. Her face was still and controlled in the way it got when she was working very hard at not feeling something she was feeling. He sat down across from her. He did not say anything. He watched the pencil move across the figures. "I am fine," she said without looking up. "I know you are," he said. "You heard. I was on the porch." She put the pencil down. She looked at her hands for a moment and then looked up at him. "I will work it out," she said. "I have 6 weeks. What if you did not have to work it out alone?" She looked at him carefully. "You do not have $90. He did not say anything. "Fletcher." Her voice was gentle but direct. "You gave Roy Gates your last 20 and you have been eating careful portions ever since. I know because I serve the portions. Do not," she stopped, steadied herself, "do not offer me something you cannot give." The thing that struck him in that moment, that drove itself into his chest like a nail in the good straight grain of the wood, was not the debt or the money or any of the practical circumstances. It was the fact that she was protecting him. She was sitting with a problem that was, to her, enormous, and her primary concern in this moment was making sure he did not stretch himself trying to help her. She thought he had almost nothing, and she was protecting him anyway. He said, "Let me see if I can pick up some extra work over in Tascosa. I know a man there who might have something." She said, "You do not have to do that," he said. "I know I do not have to. Let me." She looked at him for a long time with those eyes that were always asking a question one layer below the surface. "Why?" she asked softly. And he said, "Because you would do the same for me," which was also entirely true, and she knew it was true, and for a moment the kitchen was very quiet and warm. She looked back at her ledger. "Thank you," she said, in a voice that was only slightly unsteady. "Now stop watching me do arithmetic. It makes me self-conscious." He went back to the porch step, and he sat there with the hammer in his hand and the lie enormous and unmovable between him and every good thing, and he thought, "I have to tell her. I have to tell her, and I have to let her decide what to do with it." But he did not tell her that evening. He did not tell her the next day. He kept putting it off with the particular cowardice of a man who is afraid that the truth will take away the only thing he actually wants, which is the way she looks at him when she does not know who he is. He did go to Tascosa. He did know a man there, a general merchant named Harold Birch who had dealt with the Morrow Cattle Company for years, who recognized Fletcher the moment he walked in the door, but who was, blessedly and perhaps uniquely, a man capable of keeping his mouth shut when given a clear signal to do so. Fletcher explained the situation in the briefest terms, which was that he needed $70 moved in a way that could not be traced to him directly. And Birch, who had known Fletcher since he was 20 and inheriting everything, looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man who has seen several kinds of fool in his time and is looking at a new variety. "Does she know who you are?" Birch asked. "No, Fletcher, I know." Birch moved the $70 through a cattle brokerage account in a way that let it appear as a payment for a cattle survey that the Copper Bells land had supposedly been part of. An entirely fictitious arrangement that Birch manufactured with the calm competence of a man who had been in business too long to be scandalized by creative paperwork. Zara received a letter in early October informing her that she was owed a survey payment she had not known was outstanding from when her father had allowed a surveying party to camp on his land 3 years prior. The amount was $70. Combined with what she had, it would cover Sutter's note with a small amount remaining. Fletcher watched her read the letter at the breakfast table. He watched her read it again. He watched the smallest and most carefully controlled expression of relief move through her face, the kind of relief a person has when the thing they have been carrying down a long road is finally set down. She had not connected it to him. Why would she? He had nothing. He was a ranch hand with patched boots and borrowed wages. He should have felt good about it. He had solved the problem. The house was safe, the debt was covered, the woman he loved was not going to lose the thing she had built. He felt, in fact, terrible. Because she would never know that he had given her that. She would never know it had come from him. He had given it to her in the dark, anonymously, the same way he had given all of himself these months, under a name that was real but a story that was false. And she had no idea who she was actually trusting with her daily hours and her coffee in the lamplight and her quiet confessions on the front porch at the end of long days. He was going to have to tell her. He decided, walking back from Tascosa on that October afternoon, that he would tell her that week. That he would sit her down and tell her everything, the cattle, the land, the house in Amarillo, the deception from the beginning, all of it. That he would tell her he loved her, which was true in a way that had long since surpassed anything he had intended, and that he would let her do with all of it whatever she chose. He had almost built up to it by the morning the Cattlemen's Association letter arrived. The letter had come for him through the Coyote Flats post because the association had traced him through the telegraph exchange in Tascosa, apparently following something Cole had needed to coordinate. It had come addressed to Mr. Fletcher James Morrow in an envelope with the association's mark on the outside, and Tom Vickers had brought it in from the post and left it on the hall table where the boarders collected their mail. It had been Agnes Prout who found it. Agnes Prout, who had been watching Fletcher and Zara for months with the pleased and somewhat proprietary attention of a woman who takes credit for other people's happiness before it has entirely happened, had picked up the envelope from the hall table and seen the Cattlemen's Association seal and the full name, and had read, because she could not help herself, the letter that was not well sealed. She had brought it to Zara. She had, in fact, meant well. Fletcher understood this. Agnes Prout was not a malicious woman. She was a forthright woman who believed that people deserved to know the truth. And she had gone to Zara with the letter and said, in the most decent way she knew how, that Zara ought to read it because there was something Zara did not know about their boarder Mr. Morrow. And Zara had read it. And she had been in the saloon 20 minutes later because she had needed somewhere to go that was not the boarding house with its walls and its closed rooms, and Fletcher had followed her because he had been 2 minutes behind the whole disaster. And she had said, "You knew." And he had said, since the first week, and she had picked up the letter and left. He found her at the edge of town by the water trough where her horse was standing, and she was rubbing the horse's nose with the focused, deliberate attention of a woman who is using an animal's calm to borrow against her own. He stopped several feet away. He had the hat in his hands again. "I want to explain," he said. "I imagine you do," she said, still looking at the horse. "Zara, please look at me." She turned. Her face was not the crumpled, overwhelmed face of a woman who had been crying. It was the face of a woman who was angry with the particular clarity and control of someone who does not waste their anger, who banks it and uses it with intention. "Talk," she said. He told her everything. He told her about Cecilia Hartfield and the silverware. He told her about the years of women who looked at the house and the land before they looked at him. He told her about Cole's offhand mention of the boarding house in Coyote Flats, and the woman who ran it, and the best coffee in 3 counties. He told her about the broken wheel, and the first conversation in the road, and the moment he had looked up at her practical, unperformed, fully present face, and made a choice that he had not fully understood the consequences of. He told her about the Tascosa arrangement. He told her that the survey letter was not real, that the money had come from him, that he had moved it through Birch's accounts so she would not know. She was very still during all of this. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You gave me money," she said, "and made sure I could not thank you for it." "Yes." "Because you did not want me to know you had it." "Yes." "Because if I had known you had it, I would have." She stopped. Her jaw was tight. "What did you think I would have done, Fletcher? What was the thing you were so afraid of that you turned yourself into someone else to prevent it?" "I was afraid you would see the money before you saw me," he said. "The way everyone else does. I was afraid it would change the way you looked at me, and I wanted." His voice was not entirely steady. "I wanted someone to know me first, for once, before all of it." "You could have told me that," she said sharply. "You could have come here and said, 'I have more than I show. I want to know if you can see past it.' That would have been an honest choice. What you did instead was take away my choice entirely." That stopped him. He had not framed it that way. He had thought of his deception as removing a variable, as controlling the conditions of the experiment. He had not thought of it as removing her agency. "You are right," he said, because she was. "I have spent months worried about you," she said, and for the first time something cracked underneath the controlled anger. "I gave you the better portion at supper because I thought you were going without. I lay awake some nights wondering if you were eating enough. I felt," she stopped, pressed her lips together. "I felt things, real things, and I do not know now what was true and what was a performance." "Everything I showed you was true," he said. "The way I felt, the conversations, the evenings on the porch. None of that was a performance. I did not pretend to care about you. I did not pretend to find you extraordinary. I was pretending to be poor. I was not pretending to be." He stopped. Said the word anyway because it was past time for caution. "I was not pretending to love you." Silence. The horse shifted against the trough. Somewhere in the distance a cattle dog barked twice and went quiet. "That," she said carefully, "is not fair to say right now. I know, I am saying it anyway. Because it is convenient for you. Because it is true." She looked at him for a long, long moment. Then she turned back to her horse. "I need time," she said. "I need to think without you looking at me. All right, go back to your room, Fletcher." "It is still my room." She was quiet. "For now," she said. "Go." He went. The next 3 days were the longest of his life, and he had survived 2 droughts, a flash flood, and a land dispute that had gone to a judge in Austin. He stayed at the Copper Bell because she had not told him to leave, and he continued to pay for his keep, and he ate his meals at the table with the other boarders, and said nothing that required a response, and gave her the considerable space she had requested. Agnes Prout kept giving him the pained, apologetic look of a woman who knew she had inadvertently detonated something, and was not sure if it had cleared the ground for rebuilding or simply destroyed it. Mr. Crane, who was old enough to be philosophical, patted Fletcher on the shoulder once at breakfast and said nothing, which was the most comforting gesture available. Tom Vickers had clearly worked out that something significant had happened, and was being admirably discreet about not asking what it was. On the second evening, Zara came out to the porch. She sat in her rocking chair and he was in his, at the usual slight angle, and she was looking at the street. "I went through my father's letters," she said after a while. "He corresponded with a man named Cole Bridger. Bridger runs the Morrow operation, your operation." Fletcher looked at her. "Bridger was the man who mentioned me to you," she said. "It was not a question." "Yes." "So you came here because someone said I made good coffee and was decent?" "More or less." She made a sound that was almost, not quite, a short laugh, not warm, observational. "I have been trying to be angry at every part of it," she said. "The problem is that parts of it are—" She stopped. "The problem is that I cannot separate what I know from what I felt, and I am not sure the feeling was wrong just because the premise was." He was very still. "What I felt was real," she said, more quietly. "What I feel. That is the thing that makes it complicated rather than simple." "Simple would be walking away." "Yes," she said, "and I have not walked away yet, so—" The evening was very still. The October air had gone genuinely cool now, the kind of cool that said winter was moving down from the north and would arrive on its own schedule. "I need to understand one thing," she said. "The money for Sutter's note, the survey letter, that was you." "Yes." "Did you do it because you felt guilty?" He thought about this honestly. "I did it because I could not watch you lose your home and do nothing with the means to prevent it." Guilt was part of it, but it was mostly— he looked at his hands. "It was mostly love, Zara. If I am being truthful about everything from here forward, which I intend to be, it was mostly love." She rocked once in her chair, forward and back. "If I decide to forgive you," she said, "and I do not know yet if I will, it will not be quick, and it will not be because of what you have. It will be in spite of it and through it, because I need to know that what I see is actually there." "I understand that." "And you cannot fix things anymore without telling me," she said firmly. "No more moving money through Tascosa. No more arrangements. If you want to help, you ask." "Yes," he said, "and you tell me the truth. From this point, no exceptions, no omissions." "Yes." She stood up from her chair. She was going inside. At the door she paused, which had become a habit of hers that he had come to read very carefully. "I make good coffee," she said. "Cole Bridger was not wrong about that." She went inside. He sat on the porch for a while longer and breathed the cool October air, and let himself feel something cautious and fragile and new. October gave way to November, and the story did not move quickly, because Zara was not a woman who was rushed by other people's timelines, and Fletcher had learned enough by now to know that trying to accelerate her would be counterproductive and also wrong. But it moved. He was honest with her now, fully, about every relevant thing. He told her about the operation in Randall County, about the house in Amarillo, about the land and the cattle and the complicated machinery of what he had inherited and built. He told her about his father, James Harlan, who had been a great businessman and a sufficient father and a man who had never in his life been fully known by anyone, and how that had shaped Fletcher's particular fear of being wanted for the inheritance rather than the person. She listened to all of it. She asked precise questions. She did not flatter him about the wealth or shy from it or look at the rug and the silverware the way Cecilia Hartfield had. She treated it the way she treated the railing on the back porch that needed fixing, as a practical reality to be understood and addressed and then moved past. One afternoon she said, "You have a house in Amarillo with 12 rooms." "Yes." "That seems like a great number of rooms for a single person." "It is," he said. "Some of them I do not think I have been in since the first year." She looked at him with something that was careful and a little wondering. "You like it?" she asked. The big house. He thought about it honestly. I like what it represents about what my father built. I have never felt quite at home in it. It has always felt like a monument to someone else's life. She nodded slowly. The Copper Bell has 6 rooms and I know every inch of every one of them. I know which floorboard sounds in the mornings and which window does not close right and where the lamplight falls warmest in the evenings. I know it the way you know something you have lived. Yes, he said. That is what I do not have in the Amarillo house. That. She looked at him for a moment with that careful expression and then looked at her hands. Well, she said, perhaps it could be learned. It was the most she had offered, and he held it with both hands and did not press it further. The decisive shift happened on a Sunday in mid-November. It was one of those days that the Panhandle produces occasionally, clear and still and bright with a cold-edged light that made everything look like it had been newly painted. The main street of Coyote Flats had its Sunday quiet, the kind that comes when even the hardworking stop for a few hours and simply exist. Fletcher had gone to the small church at the west end of the street, not because he was particularly devout, but because Zara went, and he had begun to attend in September and had not stopped. The preacher, a young man named Reverend Daniel Cole, who had been in Coyote Flats less than a year, and was still a little startled by the bluntness of his congregation, had preached about honesty, which Fletcher considered either a remarkable coincidence or a pointed message from something. After the service, Zara and Fletcher had walked back toward the boarding house without planning to walk together. It had simply happened the way things happen when 2 people have the same destination and the same pace. Halfway down the street, she stopped. I am going to tell you something, she said, and I want you to let me finish before you respond. He stopped. All right. She looked at the street ahead, then at him. When my father was dying, she said, he told me that the hardest thing about the life he had built was that he had never let anyone fully in. That he had always kept a distance, always managed how he was seen, and that at the end of it, he was alone in his own head in a way that had nothing to do with how many people were in the room. Fletcher was very still. I spent 11 months running this house alone and being proud of it, she said. And I was right to be proud because it was real and I did it, but I was also lonely. And when you came, that changed, and I did not want to admit how much it had changed because I was afraid of needing something that could be taken away. She looked at him directly. What you did was wrong, she said. The deception, taking away my choice, all of it. And you know it was wrong and you are not making excuses for it, which is the only reason I am standing here saying this. He waited. But what I felt was real, she said, is real, and I am not willing to throw it away because it arrived wrapped in a complication. My life has been full of complications. So has yours. We have both been managing things alone for too long. She paused. I forgive you, Fletcher. Not all the way yet, not the kind of forgiveness that forgets, but the kind that decides to keep going, if you want to keep going. The street was very still around them, November light on the dust. The church bell finished its last echo. I want to keep going, he said, and his voice was low and unsteady with it. More than I can adequately express. She looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes that had been reading him since the day he came around the bend in the road. Then keep going, she said simply. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood in the Sunday street of Coyote Flats, and it was not dramatic or spectacular in any external way, but it was one of those moments that sets the direction of a life. December arrived with the first real cold and several developments that moved things forward at a pace that felt, after the months of careful, slow progress, almost bewilderingly swift. The first was that Agnes Prute's son finally came to collect her. He arrived on a Wednesday in a good wagon with his hat straight, and his manner apologetic. And Agnes Prout packed her things with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been ready for 2 months. She embraced Zara at the door for a long time, and she shook Fletcher's hand with both of hers and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has decided to take credit for an outcome she had not entirely intended. "You are a good man," she told him, "even when you are also a fool." "Both can be true," he agreed. She left, and the boarding house was quieter, and both Zara and Fletcher felt it. The second development was that Fletcher sent a letter to Cole Bridger with his genuine location on it, and told Cole he expected to be returning to Randall County in the new year, and that he would be bringing someone if all went as he hoped, and that the house in Amarillo needed to be properly aired and readied. Cole sent back a reply that said, "Finally, and also good luck, and also the association is driving me absolutely mad. Please hurry." The third development was that Fletcher asked Zara to marry him. He had not planned the precise moment. He had planned the asking in general, had gone to Morrison's general store and purchased a ring that was simple and honest because anything ornate would have felt like performance, and he had been carrying it in his coat pocket for 5 days waiting for the right moment, which was the exact kind of waiting that becomes its own obstacle. It happened on a Thursday evening, an ordinary evening after supper, when the other boarders had gone up, and the kitchen was cleaned, and they were sitting in the kitchen by lamplight the way they had sat in the kitchen by lamplight so many times in the preceding months, with the comfortable familiarity of two people who have found their ordinary rhythms with each other. She was reading. He was watching the lamp without meaning to and thinking about everything. He said, "Zara." She looked up. He put the ring on the table between them. She looked at the ring and then at him, and the lamplight was doing everything it could. "I am not asking you because I have money," he said. "I am not asking you because the house in Amarillo is too large for one person, or because Cole keeps telling me I should settle. I am asking you because you are the only person I have ever known who made me feel known in return. Because you are brilliant and decent and stubborn in the specific way that is admirable rather than frustrating. Because I have been in love with you since July and possibly before, and the thought of going back to Randall County and leaving you here is completely unacceptable." He paused. "You said you forgave me the kind that keeps going," he said. "This is me asking if you want to keep going all the way." She looked at the ring on the table for a long moment. "The copper bell," she said. "We would keep it," he said, "if you want to, or we sell it or find someone to run it." "Whatever you want. It is your house, Zara. I am not here to take anything from you. I am here to add." She looked up at him. "That is a good answer," she said. "Will you give me a good answer?" She picked up the ring from the table and turned it in her fingers, looking at the simple, clean, honest lines of it. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you, Fletcher Morrow." He exhaled, which he had apparently been holding for most of the last 5 days. She looked at the ring again, then slid it onto her finger, and when she looked up there was something in her face that was not performed or managed or careful. It was simply and completely happy. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "I will spend the rest of my life making the first part worth it," he said. "You already have," she said. "Now stop being sentimental. It is unbecoming." But she was smiling. She was wholly and entirely smiling, and she did not stop for a very long time. They were married in the Coyote Flats Church on the 3rd Saturday of January, 1882, which was not the warmest time of year for a wedding in the Panhandle, but was the time they had chosen, and neither of them was inclined to wait further. The church was small and cold, and Reverend Cole was visibly pleased with himself for having had a hand in a genuine love story, however peripheral. The congregation consisted of Mr. Hadley Crane, who had stayed on at the Copper Bell and was in tears from the first hymn. Tom Vickers, who was best man by default and took the responsibility very seriously. Roy Gates and his wife Alma, who had recovered from her illness and came in the wagon looking better than she had in a year. Harold Birch from Tascosa, who had the expression of a man attending the end of a very entertaining chapter. And Cole Bridger, Fletcher's foreman, who had ridden 3 days to be there, and stood at the back with his hat in his hands and the straightforward emotional sincerity of a man who had not expected to be this, moved by the end of a situation he had inadvertently started. Zara wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had taken in at the waist and retrimmed with ribbon she had bought from Morrison's. And she walked up the aisle with the calm, deliberate grace of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and has made her choice with the full engagement of her intelligence and her heart and every other part of herself. She looked at Fletcher standing at the front of that small, cold church with the pale January light coming through the window behind him, and she felt the specific quality of rightness that comes when a thing is true in the deepest way. He looked at her like a man who knew precisely how fortunate he was. The vows were the traditional ones, spoken clearly in the cold air, with full meaning behind each word, and when Reverend Cole asked if they would love and honor and keep each other through all the conditions and weathers of a life, both of them said yes, as though they had already lived it and knew it to be true. The journey to Randall County took 3 days by wagon, and they took it slowly because there was no hurry now, and the Panhandle winter landscape had a particular bleak beauty that rewarded taking time with it. They talked for all 3 days with the ease of people who have already covered the difficult territory and are now exploring the interesting parts. She asked him about the operation in detail, about the cattle and the land management and the hands who worked for him. And she asked her questions with the particular intelligent engagement that he had come to understand meant she was not simply being polite, she was actually learning. She had run a business for 11 months alone. She was already thinking about how things worked. He told her about the property, the grazing rotation, the water rights, the relationship with the railroad that was both necessary and infuriating in the way that all relationships with railroads were in 1882. He told her about the problems, the things that had not been managed as well as they could have been, the areas where he had neglected oversight in favor of being elsewhere. She listened to all of it, and when he was finished she said, "You need better bookkeeping. From what you are describing, you are losing track of approximately 15% of your operational costs in the accounting." He looked at her. "I ran a boarding house on a deficit for 11 months, she said simply. "I know what poor bookkeeping looks like. I also know what it costs." "Are you offering to fix my books?" "I am observing that they need fixing," she said. "What happens after that depends on whether you are willing to have someone who is better at it than you are involved in the operation." "I am absolutely willing," he said. "Good," she said, and looked at the horizon with the expression of a woman who had just added something to a list she was keeping. He thought, "There she is. There is the rest of my life." The house in Amarillo was in fact too large. Zara stood in the entrance hall on the January afternoon. They arrived and looked at the 12 rooms and the staircase, and the heavy imported furniture, and the wallpaper that had been fashionable in 1872, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "We are going to change the wallpaper." He said, "Whatever you like. And the parlor furniture is heavy. It makes the room feel like an apology." "Yes." She walked through the rooms in her coat, still carrying the small bag she had brought, and she went through each room with the assessing eye of a woman who had spent her adult life understanding the relationship between a space and the people who lived in it. And when she came back to the entrance hall, she looked at him with something that was starting to look like the beginning of attachment. "It has good bones," she said. "It could be lived in, properly lived in." "I would like that," he said. Cole Bridger had prepared the house, and also, apparently, a supper, which they found in the kitchen from a woman from town that Cole had arranged. And they ate it in the kitchen at a simple table rather than the formal dining room because the kitchen was warm and human and felt like the right choice. Cole himself came by after supper and was introduced to Zara properly, and stood with his hat in his hand, looking slightly stunned in the way that men sometimes are when they discover that an abstract notion they have had for years has turned out to be a real person who is considerably more direct than they anticipated. "You are the one who told him about me," Zara said pleasantly. Cole glanced at Fletcher. "I may have mentioned the boarding house in passing. You mentioned the coffee. The coffee was genuinely exceptional." She looked at him for a moment. "You also set all of this in motion," she said. "So I am not sure whether to thank you or hold you responsible." "Both are fair," Cole said carefully. She laughed. It was the warm, full laugh that Fletcher had heard at the supper table in Coyote Flats when something caught her genuinely off guard. And it did what it always did in a room, which was make the room better. Cole looked at Fletcher with the expression of a man crossing the last item off a very long list and said nothing further, which was the correct response. The winter of 1882 was the winter in which Zara Morrow, formerly Nalan, remade the operation. She did not do it dramatically. She did it the way she had run the boarding house, steadily and intelligently, and one practical step at a time. She went through the accounts with Cole and found, precisely as she had predicted from the road, a 15% gap in the cost tracking that, once addressed, allowed for a recalibration of the operational budget. She renegotiated the account with the railroad's cattle agent, a man named Prescott who had been comfortably overcharging because no one had looked carefully at the freight contracts in several years. Prescott had been visibly startled by the specificity of her knowledge and had reduced the rate. She corresponded with the Hands families through a practical welfare arrangement she built from nothing, so that men who needed time for illness in their families were not forced to choose between their jobs and their people. The Hands noticed this. It created a loyalty that Fletcher had been building slowly through respect, and she had built faster through care. And the combination of the two was something that Cole said he had not seen in 20 years of cattle operations. She also quietly convinced Fletcher to make an adjustment to the wage structure for the lower-paid hands, arguing from the accounts that the cost was covered by the reduction in turnover alone. He did not need much convincing. Fletcher, for his part, was managing the cattle side of the operation and doing it well, with the added benefit of having come back from 6 months in Coyote Flats with a refreshed perspective on what mattered. He had also, without announcing it, settled the matter of the Copper Bell boarding house. He had offered it at a below-market price to Tom Vickers, who had been looking for a reason to stop being a telegraph operator and had jumped at it, and the transfer had been completed in February with everyone satisfied. Mr. Crane had stayed on as a boarder under the new arrangement, and Tom had agreed to keep the rate the same. Zara had found out about the Copper Bell sale and had looked at Fletcher for a moment with an expression that checked whether he had done this unilaterally. "I should have asked you first," he said. "I thought it would be a good solution, but it was still your house." "It was a good solution," she said, "and you told me before it completed rather than after, which is an improvement. I am working on it." "I know," she said. "Keep working." She was not a woman who held grudges past their useful purpose, but she was a woman who maintained standards, and he was learning to meet them, which was not a hardship because they were reasonable standards held by a person worth the effort. By spring of 1882, the house in Amarillo had been remade into something that felt genuinely inhabited. The heavy parlor furniture was replaced with pieces that were comfortable and well-proportioned. The wallpaper was changed, not extravagantly, but to something that made the rooms feel like they had been chosen for living rather than displaying. Zara had put her particular intelligence to the kitchen arrangements, and the household staff, a small and competent team of 3, had the run of things managed in a way that left her neither burdened by the house nor disconnected from it. She wrote to Agnes Prout regularly, and Agnes Prout wrote back with the faithful consistency of a woman who took correspondence seriously and had many opinions about everything. Tom Vickers wrote occasionally to report on the Copper Bell's progress, which was good, and on the town of Coyote Flats, which continued in its steady, modest way. Hadley Crane sent a note at Easter saying the coffee was still good but not quite the same, which Zara found quietly touching. In the summer of 1882, they learned that she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen on a June morning, and he was so clearly and completely overwhelmed with happiness that he sat down at the kitchen table and had to collect himself for a moment, which she found both endearing and faintly amusing. "Are you all right?" she asked with the dry precision that had not changed from the woman on the road with the broken wheel. "I am very well," he said. "I am, yes, very well." She sat down across from him. "I thought you might be pleased." "Pleased is approximately 1/10 of what I am," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand, which had become one of the ordinary rituals of their daily life, the quiet touchstones that make up the texture of a good marriage. "Good," she said. In February of 1883, on a Thursday morning that was cold and clear and still, their son was born. He was a solid, loud, opinionated child from the first moments of his existence, which did not particularly surprise either of his parents. They named him James Thomas Morrow, James for Fletcher's father and Thomas for Zara's. 2 good names for 2 good men, imperfect as all men are, worth remembering. Cole Bridger, who had been waiting with significant anxiety in the parlor, was invited in to meet the boy and stood over the cradle with the expression of a man who understands that he is partly responsible for the chain of events that produced this particular outcome, and is entirely at peace with this. "Fine-looking boy," Cole said. "He is," Zara agreed, with the serene certainty of a woman who has just accomplished something considerable. Fletcher was sitting beside the bed holding his son for the first time, and looking at this small, definite person with an expression that had no performance in it whatsoever. 3 years later, in the spring of 1886, the world had shifted around them in the way that worlds do, incrementally, and then all at once. The cattle industry in the Panhandle had seen its difficult passages. The hard winter of 1885 had been brutal on the herds across the region, and several operations had not survived it. The Morrow operation had come through because of the preparations Zara had insisted on through the previous year, the feed stores laid in, the financial reserves maintained, the smaller herd that was healthier than a larger overextended one. Other cattlemen had not been so positioned, and in the aftermath, Fletcher had quietly helped where he could, sometimes with loans and sometimes with feed, and sometimes simply with sound advice from someone who had made it through. Zara had suggested, in the aftermath, that they consider a formal arrangement for helping operations that were sound in their fundamentals, but had been damaged by circumstance. A mutual aid structure, she called it, drawing from the boarding house logic of making something work for everyone through coordination. Fletcher had taken the idea to the Cattlemen's Association, and it had been adopted, not without argument, but adopted. It became a functional part of the regional system within 2 years. She did not take public credit for it. She rarely did. But Fletcher knew, and Cole knew, and the handful of families whose operations had been saved by the structure knew, and that was sufficient. James Thomas was 3.5 in the spring of 1886, and was a child who had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, and the irrepressible curiosity of someone who has decided that the world is his to investigate at close range. He had strong opinions about horses, about the cattle dog named Murphy who had appointed himself James Thomas's personal guardian, and about the story his father told him every night before sleep, which was always requested as the story about how Mama and Papa met, which James Thomas considered the finest story in existence and wanted told exactly the same way every time. "Tell the wheel part," he would say. "The wheel broke in the road," Fletcher would tell him. "And then what?" Then your mother looked at it with her very practical face and was deciding what to do when a man came around the bend. Was it Papa? It was. And was Papa very handsome? Your Papa was wearing a hat with a hole in the brim and his boots were patched with leather from an old saddle bag. But he was nice. He was nice. He tried to be helpful. And did Mama like him? And here Fletcher would pause always because this was the best part. Your Mama, he would say, liked him before she had any reason to. She liked him when she thought he was just a man passing through with nothing in his pockets. That was the most important part of the whole story. James Thomas would think about this with the solemn gravity of a child processing something large. Why? He would ask, sometimes. Because it meant she saw him, Fletcher would say. Not what he had, just him. And the boy would nod as though this made complete sense, and settle his head against the pillow. And Fletcher would sit beside him in the lamplight of the room that had been made into a nursery in the Amarillo house, with the 12 rooms that was no longer too large for one person. In the autumn of 1886, Zara told him she was expecting again. She told him the same way she had told him the first time, across the kitchen table on a quiet morning, with the same directness and the same small private smile that she reserved for things that mattered to her most. He was, if anything, even less composed about it the second time, because the first time had been abstract in a way that the second time was not. He knew now exactly what it meant. "You are going to make me sit down again," she observed. "I am already sitting down," he said. "Then you are going to stay sitting down and look at me with that expression." "What expression?" "The one that makes me feel that everything is entirely right," she said, in a voice that was direct and unguarded and completely, simply true. He reached across the table and took her hands. Outside, James Thomas was in the yard with Murphy the cattle dog, conducting some investigation of significant personal importance, his voice carrying through the open window with the cheerful relentlessness of a 3-year-old who has not yet developed any uncertainty about whether the world wants to hear from him. The Panhandle spring was doing its tentative best outside, tentative because April in the Panhandle is a negotiation between winter and what comes after, but genuinely warm in the moments when the negotiation went the right way. "A girl this time, perhaps," Zara said thoughtfully. "Perhaps," he said, "or another boy, either." "Either," he agreed. He was sure of what to do with it. He had been sure since the moment in the October saloon when she had walked out the door, and he had stood there with the hat in his hands knowing he had to earn it back, knowing it was worth earning, knowing that whatever she decided it had been the truest 6 months of his life, and the deception and the truth of it together had made him, finally, the kind of man who deserved what he had. The cattle dog barked outside. James Thomas laughed. The coffee was hot and the April light was coming through the window at the angle it always came at this time of morning. Zara Morrow set down her cup and looked at her husband across the kitchen table with dark eyes that had always seen him more clearly than he saw himself, and she said, "What are you thinking about?" And he said, "The broken wheel." She smiled. "Worst day of my life," she said. "Best thing that ever happened to me." "For me also," he said. They sat in the kitchen for a while longer, in the warm April morning, in the house that had been made whole, in the life that had been built carefully and honestly from all the complicated materials that real things are made from. And there was nothing incomplete between them, and nothing unresolved, and nothing left to fear.